build a box so you can still close the outside door.
If you say open that door, put the fan there, you would cool off what's back
Well,
there.
I would open that door and open that window, because that's got to go through that room and around the corner and everything else. So you had that big door open and blew it in from that door. Some of it would get out from that other window. I wonder if we open the door up to the belfry, is that ventilated up there?
No, they more. I think we got to close that all in because the water was getting the rain was getting in.
Bats are still in there.
Yeah, bats are in there.
So if we haven't actually made a ventilation space, all the hot air would go, if we had that open and there was a screen up there, the air would naturally cool through and all that. All we have to do is open it up and the air would come through and go right in. Chaz is here, we'll walk show me All right. Good morning, and welcome to First Universalist of New Madison on this sweltering summer day. It's now that we sit and talk about air conditioning, which we're not going to spend the money for air conditioning, but we are trying some new things. I brought in what's called a swamp cooler. It's an igloo cooler for ice with a fan in the top and an outlet where it blows cold air out. So you can put your hand next to that and see if you think that's worth it. They're extremely cheap because I got coolers I found in different places, so it doesn't all cost them the price of a fan. You can put one of those at the end of each row if you think it does any good. The other thing we've talked about is opening a couple windows at night and trying to bring the cool air in, because the problem we had here was the building was closed up all week. Not that it was like 95 degrees when I got in here this morning, so we opened the doors and turned the fans on. But if we brought it down to 70, which is what it gets to at night, it might be a little more comfortable. So something to consider. I'm always willing to try anything and willing to build anything or make anything to see if it'll work. So if you have any ideas to contribute, please feel free to do that. Any announcements? One thing we need to discuss, Derek will be here next week, but as Derek's replacement, and I forgot to print it off, they're having a Ball State professor of economics speak at El Dorado on, let's see, being a Christian in a Muslim world or something to that effect. I should have written it down, but it sounded really interesting. So I am tempted, with your understanding and your consent, to call Derek and see whether he would mind if we all went over to El Dorado and listened to that guy, and then either gave Derek his stipend or worked out some other arrangement. Because I think that would be a really interesting person to hear, and it doesn't make much sense for them to pay him to drive over from Muncie and then us to pay him to drive over from Muncie. We could even pay half his fee to defray their expense over there. The only thing would be Derek would be losing out on his income from being here, and I don't have any objection to paying him his income anyway. So if people would be interested in doing that, their service is at 10:30 next Sunday, and we'll get a hold of Derek during the week and see what he says, and then we'll send out an email reminder or put it on Facebook too. If people would be interested in doing that. But I think that would be he would be an interesting speaker here, and I would kind of hate to miss the opportunity. Unitarian Universalists being interested in education above all, this would be a good learning opportunity.
Did you say he's from Ball State?
He's from Ball State, Muncie. He's an economics professor, so I'm not sure how that relates to, it's possible he's had trips to the Middle East or I don't know. I'm just curious to find out. It's an interesting topic. Christian's view or Christian's experience or whatever in the Muslim world. Particularly at the time now, I guess we could put that in joys and concerns. The Israelis and the Palestinians are at it again, blowing each other out. So. Any other announcements? Okay. There are fans in the pews. There should be. There used to be anyway. I don't know if they're still there. And you can't use your program because we don't print programs. So,
there's no fans.
No fans.
No fans.
We had fans. So we'll find fans. We may even. The other thing I can do, I just thought about it. If you want the little fans in there, those little $6 fans from Walmart, we can actually clip those to the pew, and you can have an actual regular fan blowing on you. Or if you want to try it, I've always been kind of curious about those little mist bottles that has the fan built in them that blows kind of a cool mist out. It seems kind of counterproductive when the humidity is already 99%. I mean, I'm willing to try anything to see if it'll work. Here comes the fans.
Oh.
First fans.
All right, our prelude is a prayer of St. Francis. Beautiful way to begin the Sunday morning with music. Our chalice lighting is Across the Distance by Laura Thompson. Across the distance, the light from within me shines, sending love to all. Across the distance, your light is the fuel that warms me and helps to keep my own light burning. Together, we keep the flame of community burning bright. And as you know, community is one of our most important tenets. All right, we're talking with Roberta this week on the Indigenous problems they're having in Canada. I'm assuming most of you are aware of that because of the news. The Indigenous peoples, not only in Canada, but the United States also, their children were taken away from them and put into boarding schools, many of which were run by the Catholic Church, to assimilate them into the Canadian population. And they made a pretty horrific effort. They cut their hair, they forbade them to speak their own languages. They basically tried to remove all their heritage from them, which this started in the 1800s. when that was the mentality, but it continued in almost up into the 1960s, which was pretty amazing to think it's still going on at that time. I'm sure some people thought that was a benefit, giving them class education rather than trying to go to a school on a reservation, which I'm sure were not the best. But some horrific things were done to these kids, and I don't know what the deal is with the Catholic Church. If you remember the stories a few years ago about Ireland and the kids that were removed, or kids that, when unwed mothers would bring their kids to the Catholic Church, the things that happened to those kids were pretty amazing too. So maybe it's we're back to Lord Acton, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So anyway, Roberta has an article from the New York Times. We're going to talk about that. So the slides are going to match that. And this is and what happened in Canada was the Pope actually came and apologized. He didn't specifically apologize for the Catholic Church. He apologized for people in general, which is still a big step forward for the Catholic Church. Some people were complaining not enough. And we'll get into it as we go along. There were some other complaints, as there always are. Everybody has a different opinion. So that's what we're going to see, is some slides of the Pope in Canada. Our opening hymn is 122, Sound Over All Waters. Sing out the war vulture and sing in the dove, if only. All right, our affirmation is in the back of your hymnal, number 481. It is our quiet time. We do not speak because the voices are within us. It is our quiet time. We do not walk because the earth is all within us. It is our quiet time. We do not dance because the music has lifted us to a place where the Spirit is. It is our quiet time. We rest with all of nature. We wake when the seven sisters wake. We greet them in the sky over the opening of the Kiva. That's by Nancy Wood. And we picked that because it has a little bit of Indigenous ring to it. All right, our children's story also is connected to the Indigenous. And it is Storyberry, as you know how much I like Storyberry.
Thousands of years, humans and plants and animals long before that have been using frozen sky water to keep warm, which sort of doesn't make sense because snow is cool. You might even say it's ice cold. No one knows for sure who built the first igloo, but with the right fit and the right physics, snow can actually warm you better than the inside of a tauntaun. So how can something cold keep you cozy? The vast frozen Arctic is one of the most forbidding environments on our planet. Yet the Inuit have managed to live there for about 5,000 years, out on a pack ice, where temperatures reach 50 degrees below zero. And when it's that cold, surviving means finding shelter. It's not an area known for its forests, so nomadic hunters learned to build with the only thing available: snow. Eskimo languages really do have dozens and dozens of different words for snow, because there are a lot of different types, and the type of snow you choose can dictate whether your igloo keeps you warm or turns you into a Homo sapien symbol. To understand this, we need to know a little something about being cold. When your body temperature starts to plummet, you're feeling heat leave you. Cold can't move into your body. In fact, there's no such thing as cold. Where have I heard that before? Oh, right. Think of heat as an actual quantity of stuff. The more you give away, the colder you feel. And this trading of heat can happen in 3 different ways: by convection, conduction, and radiation. All 3 are at plenty in an igloo. A person inside will radiate body heat, which moves around the igloo by convection and is lost through the walls by conduction. This is exactly what happens in your house. Living insulation does the same thing. Fatty tissues like blubber help stop heat transfer in whales and seals, but for animals who don't have as much junk in the trunk, they cover themselves in air. Sea otter fur, for example, is about 1,000 times denser than human hair. It's snuggly stuff. This is the softest thing I've ever felt in my life. You are adorable. But the secret to its insulation power is in its texture. Otter fur is spiky, so it traps insulating air molecules. And that is exactly what snowflakes do. Powdery, fresh snow can be up to 95% trapped air. This makes it an excellent insulator. But the same way you have to pack it in your hands to make a snowball, it isn't dense enough to build with. But solid ice, on the other hand, makes a good windbreaker, but it's too heavy to lift. Inuit hunters took the Goldilocks approach. The secret to good igloo snow is somewhere in the middle. Traditional igloo blocks aren't molded. They're cut out of the ground. That tightly packed ground snow is dense enough to hold up, but because it still has far more air pockets than a block of ice, it's light and still a pretty good insulator. As usual, animals figured this one out long before humans. Polar bears, groundhogs, even birds like grouse all make snow burrows to stay warm. Even before that, plants were tucking into snow to avoid death by freezing. During the warm months, heat energy from the sun builds up in the soil, and just like the roof above your head, a deep covering of snow prevents that heat from escaping onward and upward. This snowy blanket above stops ice crystals from forming inside plant roots, and shoots, and seeds. Not freezing to death is a pretty good motivator for any animal to get crafty, but our big primate brains took it one step further with igloos. Their engineering maximizes warmth and stability. Cartoon igloos look like flat-bottomed half-spheres, but in reality, they're neither of those things. If you were to slice a real igloo in half, you'd see a shape called a catenary. This gradually sloping shape is the same one would form if you held a chain from both ends and let it droop. A catenary arch distributes weight more evenly than a half circle, without bulging or buckling. In fact, it's one of the most stable arches in nature, so sound that we still use it today. Inside, snow houses are carved in different levels. The hot air rises and the cold air sinks down into the lower part, away from where you would eat, sleep, and chill. To boot, body heat melts the innermost layer of the walls, strengthening the barrier between you, your airy snow block insulation, and the frigid great beyond. When you live in an igloo, you act as a living furnace. Over time, the temperature in your icy abode can hover some 40 to 60 degrees above the surrounding air. But bring a friend to your igloo party, and you'll get warmer faster. Stay cozy and stay curious. Hey, you remember that thing I said about Eskimos having all those different words for snow? Well, our friend from Idea Channel made a video about that. Here's an idea. You should go check it out.
Okay. Isn't it nice to talk about snow on a day like this? So luckily we're talking about Canada. Okay. Joys and concerns. We want to keep Ukraine as our joy and concern. The latest horror story is someone, and the Russians are accusing the Ukrainians, which I'm not sure I put much stock in, and the Ukrainians are accusing the Russians of bombing the largest nuclear plant in Europe is under stress. There are explosions in the transmission lines, explosions next to the actual reactors. This is like a disaster. It's like some kind of movie. And what is the intelligence level of these people to put the whole world in danger like that? I'm beginning to have less and less faith in the human constitution. Everybody knows that there are different levels of respect, different levels of judgment, different levels of wisdom, but you kind of expect the people who end up running the country as being a little on the higher level of the scale. But I guess we've proved here that that's not necessarily the case. And we are still investigating, and I'm still going to be talking about that, why it is that we seem to be voting for our own destruction and doing it intentionally. So, the Ukrainians, we have our sunflowers, they are constantly in our hopes and prayers. Thoughts and heart. I'm not going to say thoughts and prayers, we're going to say in our minds and in our hearts. How about that if we start saying that? Yes?
I'm having trouble hearing. Having trouble hearing.
Having trouble hearing? All right. I can speak up a little more. Is that better? All right. We're talking about the Ukrainians and the nuclear plant, which is in danger in the Ukraine. Mike?
A few weeks ago, I mentioned that I had a patch of sunflowers, and unfortunately the wind blew one over. I was rather disheartening because I've been watching them grow for a good while. This one was a large stalk, and I uprooted it and I staked it and I misted it every day with a flying mist as well as water profusely. Got along with about another 15 sunflowers. That one came back to life. And it was the first one to bloom. I have actually 3 blooming now. So let's hope, and maybe that's a sign that perhaps things will be better for Ukraine. But life in the sunflower patch, at least at Mike Ross's house, is going very well.
Okay, Mike's talking about a sunflower which blew over and he resuscitated. And that kind of brings me to something else I wanted to talk about. I was going to throw in later, but I think I'll throw it in now. You know the fun I have with the computer? And these are all pictures of... How many know what this is?
Yeah.
I'm going to play this for you and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Go away!
What? You've been here so much to work for the king all those years.
The king's sticking sun fired me, and thank you so much for bringing up such a painful subject. While you're at it, why don't you give me a nice paper if I can pour lemon juice on it? We're closed! Beat it, bro. Call the good squad.
I'm on the good squad.
You are the good squad.
We need a miracle. It's very important.
Look, I'm retired. And besides, why would you want someone the king's stinking sun fired? I might kill whoever you want to make the miracle.
He's already dead.
He is, huh? I'll take a look. Bring him in. I've seen worse.
Sorry. You're in a terrible rush.
The Russians say, Irish American make these rotten miracles. You get right?
65.
I never worked for so little, except once, and that was a very noble cause.
Life is critical. Children around living in starvation.
But you are right alive.
I prefer to help avenge my father. Murdered these 20 years.
The first time was bad. Where's that fellow's pay? He probably owes you money, huh? Well, I'll ask him.
It's dead, you can't talk.
Look who knows so much, huh? Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Please open his mouth. Now, mostly dead is slightly alive. Now, all dead, well, with all dead, there's usually only one thing that you can do.
What's that?
Look through his clothes and look for loose change. Come in. Hey! Hello there! Hey! What's so important? What you got here that's worth living for?
You could not ask for a woman who does that.
Son, true love is the greatest thing in the world. Except for nice MLP. What the last you made a sandwich and the mother is nice and the tomato is right. It's so cracky. I love that. But that's not what he said. He distinctly said to blame. And as we all know, to blame means to bluff. Huh? So you're probably playing cards and he cheated.
Liar!
Which?
I'm not going to tell you what, but after what you just said, I'm not even sure I'm going to be done anymore.
You never had it so good.
You said you love that.
Don't say another word, Melanie.
Ever since Finn's confidence fired him, his confidence is shattered.
Why'd you say that thing? You promised me that you would never say that thing.
What? I'm getting confident.
Speaking!
I'm listening. Love lies expiring, and you don't have the decency to say why you won't help.
Nobody's heard nothing.
Confident.
This is what the cup you are. If you didn't him, you were stuck on perfect swag. Shut up.
Wait. I make a better Humberdick's office? That is a noble voice. Give it a 65. Come on, Mickey.
That's a miracle, too.
Chocolate coating makes it go down easier, but you have to wait 15 minutes for potency. And you shouldn't go in swimming after for at least
An hour.
an hour.
Yes. Okay.
Bye-bye, boys.
Have fun storming the castle.
Is it alright?
Goodbye.
Okay, mostly dead or all dead? How many of you saw the story about the pigs? Scientists have brought pigs back to life. They killed pigs, intentionally killed them, let them lay there dead for an hour, and then they injected them with this miracle juice, which I don't exactly remember the name of, and their cells started to fire again. Their heart started to beat, their organs started to work. They were finding brain functions. What is the difference? What is the line between life and death? And have we reached a place where we may be able to reverse that? And then think about the pigs. Think about dying, first of all, think about being killed by a scientist, and then think about waking up afterwards. I read farther down in the article, and supposedly they gave the pigs anesthesia so they didn't feel any pain. That was nice of them. And then they also gave them a block so they would not retain consciousness, would not regain consciousness. When their brain function started to fire and their brain started to work, supposedly they don't think the pigs knew what was happening to them. You know how sensitive I am toward animals, and I have nothing against the advancement of science, and some of these things have to be done, but every living thing deserves to be treated with respect. So keep this in mind. That's something to think about, something we may talk about again. With all the things going on in the world, the line between life and death is beginning to disappear according to the tenets of science. Okay, any other joys and concerns? The virus is in the red zone in Montgomery County. I still am not seeing people wearing masks in the places that you congregate in Greenville, except for me and a few other older people who I'm sure are immunized or immunocompromised. But you need to do that. You need to wear your mask. You need to wash your hands. You need to be careful. We've even had experiences in the church, and I know there's experiences in New Madison where people are getting infected. Luckily, if you've been vaccinated and have your booster shots, it's usually not too serious. President Biden has had all his shots. He was exposed to the virus. He took the medicine, the medication that is an antiviral medication, and then he had, as happens to many people, a rebound experience, and he is now testing negative again. So it's not that it's a death sentence, but it is a terribly nasty thing to go through. And I guess while we're talking about that, we want to talk about monkeypox. That is spreading like wildfire throughout the country. We've had discussions, I've had discussions with people. Usually you have to have prolonged skin-to-skin contact for it to transmit. It's not something you can get from a toilet seat or a handshake or something like that. But once again, if somebody has blisters all over their hand, I don't think I would take a handshake from them. Just use common sense. All right, anybody have anything? All right, for those thoughts, prayers, those hopes, those fears, those needs that you can't express out loud, feel free to contact us in one way or another. All right, message will be on the Canadian Indigenous, and Roberta will be bringing that. Here is a picture of one of the schools with the Indian kids. I just picked a few of these out at random. This is one of the things that Roberta might talk about. The Pope was honored by one of the tribes for coming to Canada by giving him a headdress. Some of the other tribes and the other Indians thought that was a big insult to the whole principle of the headdress. So you can take whatever side you want. Basically, it's a sign of respect for someone who has done you a beneficent act, which I think most of the Indigenous, most of the Indians in Canada look at the Pope's apology as being sincere. Maybe not quite far enough, but much more than any Pope in the past has ever done, and much more than most presidents or leaders of countries have done. All right, Roberta.
This is a reading from the New York Times, and it is just about what Tim was speaking about, the people in Canada. And it starts out by saying, Pope Francis traveled to Canada to apologize to Indigenous communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the country's notorious residential school system, where thousands of Indigenous children died and countless others were sexually and physically abused. I have a bit of trouble with Indigenous. I'm not sure, I can't get in my head exactly what Indigenous is or means, but I will be using that word. The Pope's visit came after years of pleas from Indigenous leaders and leading politicians for a Vatican apology about the schools, which were designed to erase Indigenous culture and language by forcibly separating children from their families to assimilate them into Western ways. And some Indigenous leaders say it will fill in one of the biggest remaining pieces in Canada's efforts at reconciliation over a brutal education system that a national commission declared to be a form of cultural genocide. That's about education. Many of us had had thoughts about the Catholic Church for a long time, and this particular moment may sweep aside these doubts that had been there, said Phil Fontaine, the former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who 32 years ago was one of the first Indigenous leaders to publicly describe the abuse he suffered at Catholic-run residential schools. To make it all work, you have to be able to forgive, he added, and that means you have to make peace with your church. But others, especially some younger Indigenous people, greeted the Pope's visit with indifference and disdain. I don't care about the Pope. I'm very critical about the Pope's visit, said Ms. Riley Yesno, whose name you will hear later in this piece. Ms. Yesno is 23, a doctoral student at the University of Toronto, to who is from, I cannot pronounce her First Nation in Ontario. It is Eametoong. Perhaps you've heard that word, or perhaps you know how to pronounce it. I certainly don't, but it's a First Nation in Ontario. And I say that as somebody whose grandparents went to Catholic-run residential schools, this gal says, I don't see how any of those words that he's going to say will actually fix the damage that the residential schools have caused. I don't know that it will bring about healing for my poor grandparents. The Canadian government formally apologized 14 years ago for establishing the schools and has paid billions of dollars in reparations to former students. The Protestant churches that were also involved in the schools long ago followed suit. The Catholic Church ran 60 to 70% of the roughly 130 residential schools under contract to the government. Yet the Vatican, for years, has repeatedly resisted calls for papal apology. That changed after a delegation representing Canada's 3 largest Indigenous groups traveled to the Vatican in March to again press for the apology for Canada. The Pope, who apologized at the Vatican, expressing sorrow and shame for the abuses that Indigenous people endured, agreed to apologize in Canada too. The main focus of the Pope's visit is one of healing and reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous communities, he said last Sunday. But Francis's trip came as the church itself finds struggling to remain relevant to its other Canadian followers. Catholics remain the largest religious group in this predominantly Christian country, with about 38% of Canadians identifying as Catholic. Unlike some Protestant denominations that are in free fall, the share of people identifying as Catholic has undergone only a modest decline, from 43% in 1951. Now that's some time ago, but they're talking about 1951. The Catholic has undergone only a modest decline from 43% in 1951. In a country with high levels of immigration, people who identify as Catholic are the largest group among newcomers. But the number of Catholics who actively practice their faith has declined substantially in recent decades, according to surveys, particularly in the province of Quebec, where the church was once a powerful political force, but where sales of unused churches are widespread. Unused churches for sale. I suppose they're making restaurants like we see in unused churches. For Francis, his 6-day trip marked the end of a long travel drought. It was his first trip out of Rome since April, when he spent a weekend in Malta, where he appealed for better treatment of migrants. The Vatican abruptly postponed a 6-day trip to the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan that was scheduled to take place in early July, citing continuing problems with the Pope's knee that have made it difficult for him to walk. He now regularly appears in public using a cane or seated in a wheelchair, and he has apologized for remaining seated during public audiences. But he tries to walk and he is having trouble. In Canada, though the Pope will travel to 2 provinces, or he traveled to 2 provinces, the trip did not reflect his doctor's orders to take it easy. Except for the final day of the visit, which took him to Quebec, the Pope followed an uncharacteristically light schedule with no more than 1 or 2 public events and prayers in a day. A Vatican spokesman said Francis was not expected to seek additional medical assistance on the trip. Circumstances, he added, dictate whether the Pope moves on foot or by wheelchair or by using a cane or other supports. Francis may also make greater use of an open car so he can be close to people and they can see him. Francis will deliver his message of contrition at the small Cree, C-R-E-E, Cree First Nation in Alberta, at the site where a church-run residential school once stood. From the 1880s through the 1990s, the Canadian government forcibly removed at least 150,000 Indigenous children from their homes and sent them to residential schools. Their languages and religious and cultural practices were banned, sometimes through violence. A National Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded in 2015 that in addition to eradicating Indigenous culture, thousands of children died from various causes while attending the generally underfunded and overcrowded schools. These causes included rampant disease, malnutrition, accidents, fires, and abuse to the kids. Historians are still trying to determine the number of students who died at the schools. Murray Sinclair, a former judge, said he estimated that more than 10,000 children never returned home. Physical and sexual abuse by Catholic brothers, nuns, priests, and lay workers was widespread, according to records and testimony. From more than 6,000 former students, 92 recommendations included asking the Pope to come to Canada to apologize directly to Indigenous people. Exactly why Francis dropped the Vatican's previous opposition to such an apology is unclear, but many Indigenous people attribute the change to a grisly finding announced just over a year ago at an Indian residential school in the arid mountains of British Columbia's interior. An analysis of ground-penetrating radar scans found evidence consistent with the testimony of former students that hundreds of students had been buried in unmarked graves on school grounds. Similar searches are now taking place throughout the country and have revealed signs of well over 1,000 unmarked graves. Indigenous communities are grappling with the difficult question of whether to exhume those remains or leave them in place. It was a pivotal moment, said Mr. Fontaine, the former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who first sought an apology from Pope Benedict during a Vatican meeting 13 years ago. And it not only shocked Canadians, the eyes of the world then turned on Canada. Francis has called the trip to Canada a potential pilgrimage. Addressing pilgrims in St. Peter's Square, Francis said he was going to Canada to meet and embrace the Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, in Canada, many Christians, including some members of religious institutes, have contributed in the policies of cultural assimilation that, in the past, have severely harmed the Native communities, Francis said. The lack of a papal apology has been a source of tension between Catholic churches in Canada and Indigenous people. The churches have paid past $1.2 million Canadian dollars of a promised $25 million in restitution. Last fall, the churches started a fundraising effort with a goal of 30 million Canadian dollars. Like many young Indigenous people, Ms. Yasno, that I mentioned earlier, the doctoral student, said she believed that the time for apologies and reconciliation gestures has passed. and that the government needs to return land to Indigenous communities, give them political autonomy over it, and the financial means to run it. Comments, thoughts, anything?
Roberta, you may have mentioned, but who wrote the article? Was it from the Times, did you say?
It was from the Times.
And what's the background of the writer?
I don't know. I kind of also I had this.
Because it's always useful to know, I would think, are they coming from an advocacy standpoint? Obviously, if it's an op-ed piece, then they would. If it's an informational piece, then, one has to evaluate that differently.
Yes, and I don't have the name.
That's all right. Very interesting.
I
Thank you.
should have it. and I don't.
Thank you.
These kind of activities, I think, are the result of a mythology that there is one true religion. If you study philosophy, you know that if you start off with a conclusion that Nicene Christianity, for example, is the one true religion, then you would have to have a set of premises to make that conclusion what's called cogent. And that's very problematic. I've never heard one premise ever that you could use to support the idea that there's some religion that's the one true religion. But if you really believe that your religion is, then you're going to do this to people. Because you think that if you can take away their religion and replace it with the one true, then you're doing them a favor. And I think that these kind of activities are the consequences of this mythology that there is one true religion. It just, even if there is one, we humans don't know which one it is. So that's a real problematic idea, I think, philosophically, that there is one true religion.
And I'm still puzzled over the word indigenous. I asked Mike about it, and I'm puzzled over that word.
Indigenous means from the native, or was there originally. So if you have indigenous plants, if you have indigenous plants, they are plants that are native to Ohio when people came to Ohio. Like the Ohio buckeye is indigenous to Ohio. So the indigenous people were the people who were in the land when the English and the French and all the other immigrants arrived. The Vikings, when they arrived, the people they found there were the indigenous people.
So it's the same word as our Indian.
Well, and the reason they change it from Indian is Indian refers to what we talk to Western tribes are Indians, but you wouldn't call Eskimos Indians because they're not Indians, they are indigenous, and that's why they went to the more all-inclusive word indigenous because it includes Eskimos, Plains Indians, Forest Indians like the Potawatomi in Indiana, or the Shawnee from Ohio. You can call all of them Indians, but you wouldn't call Eskimos Indians. So that indigenous covers all of that. It also covers Hawaiians, the native people in Hawaii. Did someone else have a comment?
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with the Google Merriam-Webster definitions. I looked it up. I have never heard, they made a distinction of native meaning by birth. So I'm a native of Ohio.
Right.
Like that. I have not heard that distinction.
Native is kind of an all-inclusive word too, and it does mean by birth. So if you're born in Ohio, I think I told you about that. You can live we lived in Pleasant Hill for like 20 years, and and we had friends whose kids were born in Pleasant Hill, but unless you had generations in Pleasant Hill, you weren't native to Pleasant Hill. And the old joke is the New Englander that said, if my cat had kittens in the oven, I wouldn't call them muffins. So there is a real sense of place and a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging that comes for people who have been in places for generations after generations. They feel a sense of ownership or entitlement. You see that more if you look at England or someplace in Europe where there's generations follow along.
You also look at it in the botanical world, because if you read the description, say like a peony, they're indigenous is to China, but because of New World exploration and Old World and the collectability of a certain plant, it suddenly became popular and possibly even invasive in another country.
Yeah. Let me give you a couple facts. The article didn't say how many kids were taken. Over 150,000 were the numbers I got. 150,000 kids were removed. The minimum number of deaths is 10,000. And they have not found all the missing graves, all these giant burials. There were no real records kept. But this started in the 1800s, the 1850s, and lasted until the 1960s. Some of the articles I read were by conservative writers. And the one was adamant that there is no proof that this ever happened at all. You know, like the deniers, they deny that the guy that was fined $45 million because he denied that the shootings took place in out east. Those people populate the world everywhere, and they always have a big trumpet with media. So he said ground penetrating radar proves nothing because they haven't dug up any of the bodies. One of the reasons they don't dig them up is the indigenous or the Indians or the natives have a real thing about not disturbing the bodies, and that's what there's a big argument many times when, like in the American West, if remains are discovered from like 20 or 30,000 years ago, from the first people who came to America, they may have come across the Siberian Straits, and they want to examine the bodies for radio dating and see what they can find out. But many times the Indian tribes are saying they don't want the bodies disturbed and they don't want them studied. This is where you come down to your distinction between science and religion, and I tend to fall on the side of science. I think you can study the bodies and then return them to the grave with proper respect and still make some intelligent assumptions and learn some things from it. But anyway, this is a picture of ground penetrating radar. It is not a hocus pocus magic thing. I had other pictures, but I didn't put them in. Basically, it shows when the ground is disturbed. If you have ground that has never been disturbed, you get a nice even plane, an even picture all the way down. If you have ground that's been dug up, even if there's nothing in there, it will show that it's been dug up. If there's a casket in there, it will show the outline of a casket. If it was just dug up and they didn't use caskets, they just buried them in a blanket, it will still show all the humps and the bumps. And if you find a place, which is what they're doing with this ground penetrating radar at these schools, they're finding an acre or 2 acres or 3 acres where the whole ground underneath, it looks fine on top, covered with bushes and grass and trees, but underneath the ground has all been dug up and disturbed and put back again. That means somebody just went out there and dug holes and filled them in for no reason, which seems kind of unlikely, or they dug holes, put kids' bodies in them, and then filled them up again. So this guy's thing about because they don't have any actual bodies is kind of specious. It's another fake news thing from the other side. Okay, any other questions, comments? An ongoing topic, and there, as I say, there were also many schools, these same schools in the United States, the same thing goes on here. The same thing is still going on here. We all know the poverty that goes on the reservations. Many states are going into this kind of argument between, does the state have the right to remove kids from the reservation and put them in foster care? There's cases of foster parents trying to adopt these Indian kids and give them a good life, send them to college and everything else. And the law is still kind of in flux. Some states allow the Indian parents or the Indian tribe, even if there are no Indian parents, to repatriate those kids back to the reservation and include them in their cultural history. Other states say, you know, the rights of the kids to grow up in an advanced, in a positive environment outweigh that. So there are pros and cons on both sides, something to be studied. All right, if you have something to, yes?
Just, wait, did you know when we started the books?
Well, it's last week's paper.
Last week. Yeah, I can look at it.
Okay. All right. Our offering, as usual, we do the community offering. Last week was the first Sunday, wasn't it? Did we do fish last Sunday? We did or not? Whatever.
This is the first
This is the first Sunday. So this is a fish Sunday. I knew it was in there somewhere. So if you want to put something in for fish, put it in the fish plate. If you want to put something in for the church, put it in the regular church plate. If you need something, please take it out. We are here to help. Closing hymn is 16. It's a gift to be simple. And as an old Church of the Brethren, that is one of my favorites. Till by turning, we come round right. That's an old Shaker tune. They were famous for their simplicity. And maybe we need to think about that again. All right. Extinguishing the Chalice is an interfaith benediction by Gary Kowalski. Most of the material I get here comes from the Unitarian Universalist website. They have all kinds of free stuff, and that's kind of what I used to do our services. Gathered in our various faiths, we give thanks for the blessings of world community as we share our common dream, homes and schools where children thrive, neighborhoods that are safe and clean, a city rich in colors and cultures, and an economy where no one is expendable. A beloved community where rich and poor alike have access to the opportunity for a dignified and productive life. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples where our deepest hope is to be of service to a hurting world. Enable us as we leave this place to carry forth this prayer into the coming week, turning our thoughts toward charity, our hearts toward justice, and our hands toward the work of peace. Shalom and amen. We have donuts from last week. You don't eat them this week. The dog gets them. And we have cake. It's been in the freezer, but it's a nice sugar cake. I think it'll still be good. Lemonade. There's ice for lemonade there, and coffee.
Post food.
What?
Post food.
Post food, yes. And that I didn't even get what is the post food.
Oh, it's called Love is Here to Stay.
Let us hear.
Love is here to stay.
Love is here to stay. Excellent. Very nice. Thanks to Roberta for bringing the idea and the article from the New York Times for Indigenous, and we will continue to follow this story as it goes along, as we will the others. That closes our service at First Universalist of New Madison. Have a good week. Please wear your masks, even if you're the only one. If you've been infected, you don't want to pass it to somebody else, and you certainly don't want to get it from someone else who doesn't care about infecting you. All right.
Should we just advance this? Probably best for this.